Right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Lysecki. I am CMS's Senior Research Analyst, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, A Rise in the Undocumented Population After Years of Decline. The webinar is organized by the Center for Migration Studies, or CMS, a think tank and educational institute devoted to the study of international migration, to the promotion of understanding between immigrants and receiving communities, and to public policies that safeguard the dignity and rights of migrants, refugees, and newcomers. I'm excited to hand things off now to our Executive Director, Mario Russell. Mario?
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's Center for Migration Studies webinar. Matt, thank you for your introduction. It's a pleasure to have you. I am Mario Russell, Executive Director for CMS, recently come on board in June of this year. And I'm very excited to join my colleagues, Bob Warren and Kevin Appleby, for today's presentation. For maybe just to offer a brief framing and introduction for the day, published in the current issue of CMS's Journal on Migration and Human Security, Bob Warren's analysis and findings regarding trends in the US undocumented populations over the last decade, from 2011 to 2021, are both significant and striking, because they result from a particularly accurate estimation procedure and offer some intriguing findings. But first of all, I think there's a question here that you might ask is, why doesn't today's presentation cover undocumented populations through 2023, or for that matter, even through 2022, excuse me.
57.
And we will have to wait for those analyses. Because the most accurate public estimates of the size of the undocumented population, which is produced by the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey, those are not available for over 12 months after the close of a calendar year. So for 2022 data, we will not have access or any kind of ability to review that until early 2024. And therefore for 2023 data, a year after that or more, usually ending really towards early 2025. But that said, we may have a sneak preview, because CMS is examining other public data sources and working to develop some preliminary estimates with our methodology used and applied to those sources for 2022 and 2023. And we do expect to finalize some of this work in the near future, so do stay tuned. Now, what are the top line findings that Bob will share and provide a deeper dive into, and that Kevin will further contextualize from a policy perspective? Let me just offer two. In 2021, the undocumented population residing in the United States increased slightly to 10.3 million by about 100,000 against the year before. This slight upward tick, whose statistical value Bob will discuss, may point to a new direction after gradual decline and near zero growth of the population for the last 10 years or so. But that said, really doesn't indicate a growth trend. It's hard to say, and as I mentioned, Bob will address the materiality of this shift. But there are two potentially important factors in play that could point to something more, or perhaps a bubble in growth. One is the relative value of apprehensions at the southern border, and two, legislative paralysis, as we say in Congress, that is, failure to create new pathways and to modernize immigration laws. The second point that I wanted to highlight is CMS's finding that there's a remarkable decline of almost 1.9 million in the Mexican undocumented population from 2011 to 2021. And interestingly, that is about 600,000 more than the total population increase from the 7 fastest growing US undocumented populations, which again, Bob will review. Our research reveals, I think, a striking and unexpected cause for that drop when looking at the 4 traditional causes for a decline: deportation, death, adjustment of status, and departure. So does this drop, compared with the rise in other country arrivals, tell us something new? Anyway, let's begin. Today's format will be as follows. We will hear from Bob for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll hear from Kevin for a policy response and analysis. Then we'll have a chance for questions and answers, of course. And remember that you can at any time type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. At the end of Kevin's presentation, I will then read out the questions and we'll take it from there. After that, of course, we'll wrap up. So a quick introduction of Bob. I am delighted to introduce Robert Warren, who is a senior research fellow at CMS and longtime colleague and partner. Bob served as demographer for 34 years with the US Census Bureau and the former Immigration and Naturalization Service, and directed its statistical division from 1986 to 1995. Bob's expertise in projecting accurate ranges of the number of unauthorized immigrants got its start at that time, and he is now the authority on this subject nationally, with numerous publications and many appearances before Congress, United Nations, and other bodies. Kevin comes to us, and it's my pleasure to introduce him as well. Senior Policy Fellow at CMS. He previously served at CMS as Director for International Migration Policy and as Director of Migration Policy and Public Affairs at the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops from 1998 to 2016. Previously, Kevin had worked for Senator Russell Long and several select committees of the U.S. Senate. So welcome to both of you. And with that, Bob, I'll turn it to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. Today, my presentation will mostly be about the trends in undocumented immigrants from 2011 to 2021. And as Mario said, sort of stealing my thunder a little bit there, the big news was the significant decline in the population from Mexico. It dropped from 6.4 million to 4.4 million, or about 1/3 in just 10 years. I think there's also a lot of interest, as we all expect, in what's happened in the last year or two. And even though we don't have estimates of the population for this year and last year, a lot of the things that I'm going to describe for you today are relevant to understanding whether or how much that it might be increasing. So, and the last couple of slides are directly relevant to that. So with that, I think am I ready to move on? With that, I think I'll go ahead and share my screen. And okay, we've started here. My first slide after this one, a colleague suggested that I don't show it because it talks about our methodology, and she said that I would probably lose our entire audience. But I have a lot more faith in the audience than that, so I'm going to show it anyway. So the next slide basically describes our methodology, and thankfully it's short, and then we'll move on after that. So what we do to get these estimates in great detail is step number one there. We go into the American Community Survey and we select all of the non-citizens that arrived after 1981. That's where all the undocumented immigrants are. If you came in before 1981, you legalized under IRCA, or you've had a very long time to become legal. So that's where all the undocumented population is. The next thing we do is we take out as many legal non-citizens as we can identify. And legal non-citizens are, for example, people who receive Medicare or Social Security. They're recently arrived foreign students or military and government folks, refugees and other groups. So we take out all of those, and that leaves the possible undocumented population. Step two is kind of is an adjustment that we do to take that data from being possible undocumented immigrants to almost all undocumented immigrants. It's an adjustment ratio from 2020 that I won't go into, but it's in all of our methodology. So we essentially reweight number one to arrive at the population in number three. At that, excuse me, at that point, we have microdata for the entire undocumented population, which means we can compile the data for any variable and at any geographic level that the ACS data collects. Now we do the same procedure for every country of origin. We do the same procedure each year from 2011 to 2021. And the last step in our methodology is to adjust the data for undercount in the ACS. So once we've done that, here are the major strengths of our methodology. For one, they're timely. We can make estimates 1 month after the ACS data is released. And by the way, the data for 2022 is going to be released probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm guessing we'll have estimates of the 2022 population by the end of the year. Whether or not we're able to produce a report that quickly, we should have estimates in hand by the end of the year. And we're a little bit late with these 2021 estimates, partly because there was a lot of confusion about undercount, but that's a different subject that I won't go into. The second major strength of our methodology is that it's uncomplicated, as you saw. I hope you agree with that. We don't require any administrative data. We don't try to estimate what the legal population is to subtract it from the total. We don't use data on immigration, immigrants. We don't use any of that stuff. We just do what I showed you in that slide. Our estimates are comprehensive, as I mentioned. We can compile data for any geographic area and any variable included in the ACS. This is a point which I used to give our website so people could go and look that up. I lost a lot of audiences doing that. So I don't do that anymore. And maybe later I can give you that. So let's start with, I mean, basically the idea here is to look at trends. So let's look at some trends. And we've been talking about the drop for Mexico. And I think this is a very interesting slide, not just because of the big drop, but you see in the first 3 or 4 years, the numbers don't really drop. And you know, you might ask, well, why is that? And I think part of the reason is that in 2013 and 2014, we were considering a legalization program. And conventional wisdom says that if you're considering a legalization program, you know, people will come to the country to try to get in on it. But that we found that's not what happens. What happens is people are less likely to leave. And we showed that in our 2019 report. So I think that's kind of what was going on here. And DACA was enacted during this period of time, generally a friendly attitude toward immigrants. So then 2015 through 2020, you'll see that it just dropped off. And we show in the paper that the drop off wasn't because more people were removed or they died or they became legal residents. It was because more people left. Undocumented immigrants from Mexico increasingly left the US. And now you might say, well, why is that? And well, the answer is we don't really know. But we do know that there were, the legalization program failed. DACA came under fire. There were threats of mass deportation. There were widely publicized efforts to keep undocumented immigrants out of the 1980 census. In general, after 2015, the atmosphere toward immigrants was pretty hostile. Don't know if that was the real reason, but all of those things happened, I think. So let's look at this decline for Mexico by state of residence. The thing that's striking is that this decline occurred all across the country. And it occurred for every state. Every state lost undocumented Mexican population between 2010 or 2011 and 2021. And the fourth column shows the percent drop. And the total dropped by 30%. And you'll see that all of those other states, we're showing the top 15 states here, they declined between about 20 and 40%, right around the, give or take, the 30% mark. And so it was a nationwide decline. I think it's kind of interesting that the largest declines were from New York, and California was right up there. States that had sanctuary policies. I'm not a policy analyst, so I can't comment on that, but I thought that was interesting. So next, let's look at a list of countries other than Mexico that declined during this 10-year period. And you'll see the countries here. Just looking at the bottom country, Poland, has been dropping for some time and dropped steadily. It dropped from 75,000 to 35,000. Most of the undocumented population in Poland lives around Chicago and the New York metro area. Before I leave this slide, there's one other thing I want to point out. If you look at Ecuador, these, by the way, these have not been smoothed in any way, so that's why they kind of jump around a little bit. But look at the orange line for Ecuador. It generally goes down, 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 down. Oh, then it goes back up right at the end. And that is probably not a statistical fluke. As you read in the New York Times a few weeks ago, things changed in Ecuador a couple of years ago, having to do with cartels and so forth and so on. But what we've noticed in all of our data is that when things are going well, for example, as they are in Poland, more people leave the country than come here. When that changes, the flow changes, as I'm afraid it has done in Ecuador. So let's look next at countries that are increasing, which moves us closer to some comments about increasing populations. These 6 countries had the largest increase over this period of time we're talking about. Not surprising to see El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, India, Brazil, and especially Venezuela has really shot up during this period. And you kind of see that the numbers went up maybe more in the second half of this decade than they did in the first. So the countries with the largest increase have been increasing. You might wonder, well, where's China? Where's China on that list? The answer is China didn't appear on the list because the undocumented population from China peaked around 2015, and then it declined gradually all the time from 2015 to 2021. Not sure what that's about, but that's what the data show. So at this point, this would have been the end of my presentation, except that I decided to show a couple of more. Well, before I do that, one of the things that we see for the decline for Mexico and in all of our data is that large numbers of undocumented immigrants leave the country each year. It causes some populations to actually decline, Mexico quite a lot. Somewhere between maybe 800,000 or 1 million leave every year. And the reason I kind of stop and accentuate this is that this is relevant to what's happening in the last year or two. A lot of people see, oh my goodness, 2 million, 1.5 million, 2 million apprehensions. That must mean that the population is growing that fast. Well, it's not. We don't have the data yet, but I believe that that's not true. And I have some evidence that apprehensions don't correspond to population growth. This next slide is based on published data, and it shows it shows border apprehensions in the orange bars, and it shows population growth in the blue bars. So in the 1990s, we had 13 million apprehensions, and the population grew by 3.4 million. From 2000 to 2009, we had 10 million apprehensions, and the population grew by 2 million. By the way, around 2000 was the last big peak in apprehensions, and there were about 1.8 million. And the population grew by 800,000 during that particular year. In the last decade, we've had 4.3 million apprehensions, and the total undocumented population dropped by 1.4 million. So this is just something to keep in mind, that the apprehensions don't equal population change. And also, I think the Border Patrol does probably a better job than most people realize. And before I turn this back over to Mario, I want to show you one more slide. And this last slide is a cautionary tale. That sounds very dramatic. It's not really that dramatic, but it's something that's very important in terms of reporting on this population and understanding what's going on. And so I'm going to show you this slide, and the slide comes directly from congressional testimony in the last couple of weeks. And it's not my slide, it's from that testimony. And here's what it is. Okay, this slide, so the title of it is "The Illegal Immigrant Population Has Rebounded Substantially Since President Biden Took Office." Okay, and if you and these are just based on published numbers. If you look at this graph and you interpret it the way the person who testified before Congress does, well, the population was kind of going along at 11.5 million, and then all of a sudden it just dropped to 10 million around January 2021. Well, according to this, since then, well, the population has grown by 2.4 million. That's stunning, except that it's not true. The 10.2 million actually should be 11.2 million. And the reason for that is, and we published a report on this last year, roughly 1 million undocumented immigrants were not included in the 2020 census, and also in the 2020 ACS. Some other people might want to quarrel with that, but I think our statistics are pretty good on that. So what I'm saying is that 10.2 million, just move it up to be 3.2 million. And just to go from what I think are pretty good numbers to pretty good numbers, let's just go from 2019, which is 11.5 million, up to 2023, which is 12.6 million. So that shows the population, according to this graph, the population grew by 1.1 million over about 4.5 years. And I'm guessing that's quite a lot less than most observers really think will happen. And we don't know yet. As Mario said, we are working on some better numbers. But one reason I show you this is to say, watch out for these kinds of graphs, because they don't really tell the full story. And I think with that, I am going to stop and turn it back to Mario.
Bob, thank you so much. A lot there. And again, thank you for that, particularly that last slide. And I think it's going to invite quite a bit of discussion. Let me just say, before I introduce Kevin and pass it to Kevin, just a reminder to folks, if you want to put a question in the question box, please do so. and so that we have some attention that can be given to that. Kevin, if I can turn it to you for your remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I just wanted to make a few comments on Bob's presentation and translate it to what we're seeing today in Washington and in Congress, and how I think that our responses to what's happening at the border are a bit overblown, certainly by immigration opponents in Congress. The first point that Bob made, which was, I thought, significant to this current context, was that apprehensions and the growth of the undocumented population is not a one-to-one ratio, not even close, as some immigration opponents would say. Also, what is never discussed by immigration opponents, and frankly even not discussed by the media, is that people are leaving. And we've seen from Bob's slides that Mexicans are leaving, but other countries are leaving as well, which is never reported and which adds, context to what's going on here. So some of the fear tactics that are being used by immigration opponents are just that, fear tactics. I'm not saying that there's not a reality on the border, that there are people that are coming at higher numbers right now. But what I am saying is how they portray that and how they frame it as a threat, even an existential threat to the US, is misleading. The undocumented population, it may jump. We don't know for sure how much, but in 2021, it only jumped 100,000, which was almost negligible, right? It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 2 years, but it's not a one-to-one ratio. And in their messaging and in their positions and in their floor statements, they like to create fear that we're being overrun, we're being invaded, et cetera. And the numbers just don't bear that out. And what we're seeing now, sadly, is the Republicans tying aid to Ukraine to making changes at the border that are draconian and do not correspond with what the reality really is. And I must say, I'm a bit disappointed in Senator Graham and Senator Cornyn and even Senator Langford, because they have been part of bipartisan negotiations on immigration reform in the past. And they know how important it is to get meaningful change. You have to engage with the other side of the aisle. And now they've given that up. And they're even mixing it with a national security question and jeopardizing perhaps national security through the Ukrainian war. And that is something that is disturbing to me, that they have taken that tack, especially as you consider the Republican Party were on the front lines of the Cold War, during the Reagan period, and understood the threat of an expansionist former Soviet Union. Apparently that is not a priority anymore. Apparently scoring immigration points with their base is more important. I think, and I have great respect for all these senators, but it's a sad situation when we've come to the point where they're mixing these two issues, which actually are different, frankly. We're not under existential threat by what's happening at the border, but Ukraine is certainly under a threat, an existential threat, as we speak, and could lead to, further conflict if they lose that war. So indeed, changes should be made. Changes need to be made to our immigration system, to our asylum system. But this is not the way to go about it. It cannot be done in a vacuum and with one side holding a gun in their hand. We all know that any meaningful immigration reform must go through both sides of the aisle. And I call upon the Democrats, especially President Biden, to insist on this and not flirt with a compromise on the supplemental bill. Well, whether opponents like it or not, immigration reform must happen in order to get our system operating more efficiently, but it needs to be done in the light of day and through the regular order to have legitimacy. And I know that's a dirty word in some circles now, immigration reform, especially in the Republican circles, but they're going to have to come to the reality that to fix our system, the best way to do it is to work with Democrats and provide a comprehensive solution. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. And, I think you bring us to a fundamental understanding and awareness that when we talk about the undocumented and the importance of getting the facts right with respect to that population, ultimately has everything to do with the larger issues and the intractable issues of immigration reform, asylum reform, border reform. So at the highest level, we connect to the particulars of Bob's findings. We have a number of questions. And I think, Bob, we may need to begin with a sort of a 101, a moment of undocumented course 101. And if you could help to distinguish and maybe clarify who is undocumented. I think many on this call are experts and maybe some others aren't. And to put the right frame in terms of your analysis around who gets counted as an undocumented person and who does not, right? Whether they're immigrant visa holders, non-immigrant visa holders, asylum seekers, parolees, and to the extent that you can help maybe sort of define that universe, because I think the question today in part is what we read about in the news is the arrival of parolees, whether under the 30,000 a month program or whether at the border. And can you shed a little bit of light on that to help us and the group tease out what's in and what's out of your analysis?
I'd be glad to do that. I won't be able to totally clarify it, but I can tell you what we do. Essentially, as I showed in the slide, we take all those people who get counted in the ACS who came in after 1981, and we remove all the legal ones we can, and then we have a control percentage that we use. What ends up happening is that essentially people, and this is true for everybody's estimates. There are 5 organizations that make estimates, and everybody includes. There's no way to exclude people who have TPS, those kinds of categories, and in some cases even asylum seekers. They end up in the estimates of undocumented immigrants because that's kind of what our methodology. We don't have any way of taking them out, and in particular, more recently, I think there have I read the papers. There have been a lot of huge increase in asylum seekers. People are released into the U.S. Until their case is adjudicated. According to U.S. and international law, asylum seekers are not undocumented until their case is adjudicated. If they go to court and they're turned down, then they should leave the country. But in the meantime, in terms of our estimates tend to be inflated by these categories that are really difficult to estimate, basically. And I'd be happy to answer any other more detailed questions about that, if I can.
Sure. Well, Enrico Marcelli asked specifically there, if I can follow up, Bob, could you say something about the characteristics that you use to separate the unauthorized from legal residents, and then parentheses, LP, NIV, et cetera, in step 2. So you may have answered that mostly, but that's a little bit more specifically his question.
I'd like to say hi to okay. I wanted to say hi to Enrico, but I didn't know if it was okay or not. But
Sure.
I guess I did. I guess I just did. Well, basically, what gets into different categories is, as I said, you know, the non-citizens get counted in the ACS. We do our best to take out all the legal ones we can, and then we use our sort of a magic ratio to get to the real undocumented population. So whatever's in the answer to your question is whoever's included in that after we've reduced the numbers down to the undocumented population. And I guess basically it's who's counted in the ACS minus the ones we can take out. So yeah, that's how it's done. And but okay, I guess I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Kevin, you sort of brought up a very interesting point, and I think again the connecting of the need for reform and how ultimately the conversation ties to questions such as these, and the chart that Bob showed us about, right, a particular testimony offered about the rise of undocumented. You mentioned something about the need for changes. Can you speak a little bit just about that from your perspective? What are the changes, sort of top line changes that you think we need to see to the extent you can talk about the sort of border processing, perhaps asylum processing, and sort of what are the basic principles that guide your thinking around that?
Well, first of all, I think you need to look at all parts of the system, not just the border, and that includes what do we do with the 10.5 million undocumented that we have now, which I know to some is anathema, but you have to consider that. You have to look at our legal immigration system. Is it working correctly? We've got years and years of waiting times for certain categories. Do we need all the categories? Do they respond to the reality? Should we look at family immigration and figure out what do we do with extended family? There are all these type of questions that have been debated in immigration reform. I mean, the asylum system is broken. I think everyone agrees with that. I mean, we've got years and years of waits to get an asylum hearing. I think the balance to be struck is to have the due process available, but in a more expedited manner without sacrificing, the due process aspects of it, that people do have time to get a lawyer, do have time to prepare, etc. But in all frankness, we do definitely need to look at that system and see how we do it better. I mean, CMS just issued a report on the court system, the immigration court system, and how it's been severely underfunded over the years and almost neglected. And that's why we have some of the backlogs. But of course, there's no funding in the supplemental for this that I saw. It's more, I mean, there is funding for immigration judges and there is funding for representatives, but to undergird the system itself, there's not as much funding. And there's certainly funding for detention and for Border Patrol. So we need to look at it in a broader manner to make sure that all pistons are running equally. And unfortunately, we're at a place politically in our country where we cannot get to that space. We can't get to the common space that we need to get to come to an agreement. And it's sad that that is the case. The issue has become overly politicized in the last, since 2016, that it has prevented any movement whatsoever in Congress to look at some solutions. So those are just some of the points, I think. I mean, there's a lot more issues that may not be apparent that need to be looked at, but we need to return to like, let's do this in a bipartisan way, and show some statesmanship here, and not get beyond our polarization on this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And sort of reminds me that even Bob, in your comments about what happens to those who seek asylum, right? And they are pushed into a system that, as Kevin says, is broken, and not only broken but overburdened, and to some extent antiquated, right? Sort of laws and procedures that maybe don't fit the day. So asylum seekers who seek protection and want to be heard then are put into a system that is both under-resourced and inadequate to the task, and that just creates, right, a longer, protracted displacement experience and stay in the United States, which doesn't serve anyone's purposes at all, and potentially creates another class of undocumented down the road. We have time for just a few more questions. Bob, there was a question here from Juan Pablo Garnham, who asks if you could talk about the overall numbers and percentage growth declines by state. Now there are a lot of states, so maybe you can pick a few if that's something you can do that are most intriguing, and maybe otherwise there's places where you can refer to in the report.
Excuse me, yeah. Well, I showed that one slide that showed the decline by state for Mexico, and it's very interesting. For Mexico, every state dropped, so that's a clear-cut case. But I don't actually have a slide to show you, but I can tell you that in terms of the total undocumented population, not every state dropped. For example, Florida is getting a lot of people from Venezuela, and these new, more recent large flows are going into particular states, and so those states are not declining as others are. I'm sorry, I don't have a slide to show you, but essentially, when I look at the change by state, it's not uniform the way it is for the ones from Mexico. It's very different. Like I say, Florida is increasing, so that's about the best I can do with that. Sure. I think.
No, that's great. Thank you. I think that about gets us to our time.
Actually, Mario,
unless Kevin, you wanted to add something. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think Zita's question, the last question.
Oh, I didn't see that. I'm sorry.
It's on, as I recall, it's on what number should we use for undocumented? Do we use the 10.5 of 2021 or the 12 plus million? The 12 plus million, Bob, you can take over, but that's a projection. That's not based on any numbers.
Yeah, that's one of the things I meant to mention when I showed that last slide, that basically the line that you see and all those numbers are about 1 million higher than our numbers. Yeah. And there's a long, complicated reason why that's true, and it has to do with how people make their estimates and so forth. But just those lines are about 1 million too high. And we could debate that, but that's the reason. Those are not our estimates. Those are based on other organizations' estimates.
Thank you, Bob and Kevin. Actually, I hadn't scrolled down. I didn't see Zita's question, which was crucial. So thank you for that. Yeah, and I think, Bob, this is maybe part of the sneak preview about some of the studies maybe that you'll be doing over the next, couple of weeks or whatever, months, about taking a look at some of that preliminary data. I think it's important for us to see how well we can update 2022 at least, and perhaps even 2023. I think these facts matter, particularly going into the 2024 election cycle.
Mario, can I interrupt
sure.
you just a second?
Sure.
I know we're right at the end, but I wanted to make one quick comment on the question to Kevin about what can we do. And CMS has published reports, two ideas that stand out for me. One is that for about 100 years in this country, we had something called the registry provision. And that said that if you've been here more than 15 years, you can come in and adjust to legal status. And they changed that about every 15 years for well over 100 years, up until they passed IRCA. And that was in 1987. They set the date at 1972, and it hasn't been changed since. If it had been updated regularly the way it should have been, the undocumented population would only be half of what it is. So I just thought I'd throw that idea in there.
That's an important one, Kevin. I'm sure that you would have what might be the rebuttal to that argument, or at least what it means to move the registry date forward and how that might be perceived, as some kind of statutorily written legalization program, right? So I can understand that there's a lot of resistance to that.
Well, it's the easiest way to do it. Really. Right. The question I would have for Bob, though, is how would that reduce the number of undocumented? Because how many of the older who would be older have left or may not be with us anymore? It depends on where they put the registry date, of course.
Well, the registry date was always 15 years or more. If you've been here 15 years or more, and at this point, exactly half the undocumented population has been here 15 years or more. It would cut the population in half.
Wow, okay. Well, that if I could wave my wand, that would be something I would recommend, certainly.
I don't think we'd be here.
That's right. Well, Matt, if you can confirm I'm not missing any questions, which I don't think I am.
There's a question on
There's one more
on DACA.
Okay, I don't see that. Can you read that out?
The question is, I think this is for you, Bob. Do you have any research on the number of DACA recipients who have left the country for their home country or another country to take up residence?
No, we don't have that kind of data on immigration. Although I would. This gives me an opportunity to say something about the DACA numbers. The DACA numbers. It turned out the number of people who came forward for DACA was important for calibrating our estimates of the undocumented immigrants, because it's one of 2 or 3 cases where there was administrative data to verify our projection based on we had estimates of the population. A DACA was enacted, and everybody said, okay, how many are coming forward? How many? And we said about 1.2 million based on our data. Turns out it was about 800,000. That tells us we're not really low. We're not as low as those folks at Yale think we are. I promise I won't go into that. But it allows us to calibrate our estimates. And we just can't make estimates that fine. That's what the answer is, really.
Bob and Kevin, thank you very much. And thank you to those of you who attended and stayed a little over time. I would say, pay attention to our announcements. I think we may have a follow-up webinar perhaps in the next couple of months or more, but kind of following up on this issue further. There's a lot to say. So again, thank you for the time, and thank you to the panelists and Matt for helping us get this organized.